Water pollution, livestock operations, particularly large factory farms, have contributed to significant water pollution, with runoff from feedlots and fracking operations contaminating groundwater. Legislation and legal challenges. Despite regulations like the Packers and Stockyards Act and the Clean Water Act, enforcement has been inconsistent, leading to ongoing legal battles and environmental degradation. Cultural shift. The traditional family farm has largely disappeared, replaced by large-scale, industrial operations that have reshaped the agricultural landscape and rural communities across the United States. Chapter 6. Two World Wars and the Great Depression. Early 20th century agricultural struggles. Farmers faced ongoing challenges after the late 19th century agricultural depression. Prices for key crops like wheat, corn, and cotton dropped drastically, leading to economic hardships. Farmers often had to burn surplus grain due to low market prices, highlighting the economic imbalance. Deforestation and its impact. Eastern woodlands, crucial for small farmers, were devastated by deforestation. Expansion of commercial agriculture led to the destruction of native grasslands in the Midwest and Southeast. Sharecropping and tenant farming practices depleted soil nutrients, leading to increased erosion and environmental degradation. Great Depression and landless farmers. Over 8 million farmers, both black and white, lived as landless farm laborers during the Great Depression. Deforestation and loss of rangelands exacerbated the poverty and food insecurity among these farmers. Farmers became increasingly dependent on limited and poor-quality food resources. Emergence of agricultural infrastructure, 1914 to 1954. Despite hardships, the era saw the development of infrastructure that modernized farming. Government involvement in agriculture increased, leading to changes that set the stage for industrial farming. The percentage of the workforce in farming dropped significantly by 1950. World War I and agricultural boom. The demand for food during World War I boosted wheat production and led to a temporary agricultural boom. Wheat acreage and production increased, particularly in the Midwest and Great Plains. However, the post-war period saw a steep decline in farm prices, leading to financial difficulties for farmers. Social changes due to World War I. The Selective Service Act of 1917 led to widespread conscription, pulling young men away from farms. Women took on larger roles in agriculture and industry, significantly impacting societal roles. African American migration from rural areas accelerated, driven by segregation and limited opportunities in the South. Government policies and economic challenges. In the 1920s, the federal government's land distribution policies favored speculators, worsening the plight of small farmers. The post-WWI economic downturn hit farmers hard, especially those who had expanded during the war. The Great Depression only deepened these struggles, with many farmers already facing financial ruin. Migration and decline of rural communities. The Great Migration saw millions of African Americans leave the South, seeking better opportunities in the North. Small farming towns began to decline as populations moved away, leading to the closure of social centers. Land consolidation favored wealthier individuals, further marginalizing small farmers and accelerating rural depopulation. Long-term impact. By the 1950s, the transformation of American agriculture was well underway, with industrial farming becoming dominant. The hollowing out of rural America continued, with fewer small farmers and increasing reliance on mechanized, large-scale agriculture. The social fabric of rural communities deteriorated, with schools and other institutions shutting down due to population decline. Farmers' reaction and organization. Farmers formed organizations like cooperatives and fielded political candidates at various levels in response to economic pressures. The Grange and Farmers' Alliances in the 1870s and 1880s, and the Southern Sharecroppers Union in the 1930s, were key movements. Farmers recognized their labor created wealth for landlords, merchants, and dealers who took rents and crop shares. Farmers' population decreased from over 30% to less than 2% by the 20th century's end. Despite efforts, farmers couldn't counter the growing power of industrial farms. Economic challenges and government response. The Great Depression exacerbated farmers' difficulties, with programs like crop price supports and insurance emerging in the 1930s. World War I temporarily boosted farm income, but post-war, prices and incomes plummeted, leading to increased farmer debt. The farm debt soared to nearly $11 billion by 1923, creating a crisis. The McNary-Haugen bills of the 1920s aimed to stabilize prices but were vetoed twice by President Coolidge. The 1929 Agricultural Marketing Act created the Federal Farm Board to stabilize prices, but it was ineffective during the Depression. New Deal and Agricultural Adjustment Act, AAA. The AAA of 1933 aimed to reduce crop overproduction through voluntary acreage reduction in exchange for parity prices. The program established an allotment system, where farmers self-regulated planting based on historic quotas, creating a rural aristocracy. The allotment system largely excluded small farmers, tenants, and sharecroppers, particularly affecting black farmers. The wealthiest farmers benefited, using subsidies to acquire more land and mechanize, further marginalizing the landless poor. The Dust Bowl and soil conservation. The Dust Bowl of the 1930s, caused by drought and poor farming practices, devastated the southern Great Plains. Severe dust storms destroyed homes, crops, and livestock, leading to widespread human misery. Congress responded with soil conservation measures, including taking 140 million acres out of production and establishing the Soil Conservation Service. The 1938 AAA linked soil conservation with crop production, increasing the Commodity Credit Corporation's role in stabilizing prices. Surpluses from CCC-supported crops were used for food relief programs like school lunches and food stamps. Long-term impact and modern farm policy. The New Deal and World War II helped stabilize agriculture, leading to lasting farm bill components like crop insurance and disaster aid. Despite reforms, farm subsidies largely benefit the wealthiest farmers, with little change over decades. The number of farmers continued to decline, but the farm lobby remains powerful, securing substantial federal support. Efforts to conserve soil have had mixed success, with harvested acreage remaining stable until the 1960s. Economic and social legacy. The Farm Bill continues to involve significant taxpayer funding, with most subsidies going to the wealthiest farmers. The transition from draft animals to tractors eventually reduced the need for fodder acreage, slightly reducing total harvested land by the 1960s. The farm lobby, supported by urban legislators due to nutrition programs, continues to advocate for substantial subsidies, despite a shrinking farmer population. Era of animal power, 1914 to 1954. From 1914 to 1954, animal power dominated U.S. farms with an estimated 25 million horses and mules in use by 1930. Early tractors, often steam-powered, were initially used to pull combines and threshers. By World War I, fewer than 100,000 tractors were in use in the U.S., with some still powered by steam and others by kerosene. Growth of tractor use. Tractor use increased after conversion from kerosene to gasoline and the introduction of electric starters. The number of tractors rose to 300,000 by the early 1920s. Henry Ford's mass production introduced the affordable Ford Sun tractor in 1917, selling for $750, sparking competition and driving down prices. The Midwest led tractor adoption, particularly in the corn and wheat belts, where tractors could effectively work the flat, dry lands. Regional disparities in tractor adoption. By 1930, tractor use had matured with over 1 million tractors in operation. The North led with 24% of farms using tractors, followed by the West, 19%, and the South lagging at 4%. The South's reliance on sharecropping and tenant farming, along with a preference for animal labor, slowed tractor adoption. Challenges and reluctance to adopt tractors. Tractors were expensive and prone to breakdowns, requiring gasoline instead of homegrown fodder. Farmers were hesitant to let hired hands operate tractors, often using them only when they could operate them themselves. Some farmers, especially in the South, preferred working with animals and resisted the shift to mechanization. Significance of tractors in agriculture. Tractors revolutionized agriculture, allowing for more efficient plowing, planting, cultivating, fertilizing, and harvesting. John Froelic's innovation of adding a gasoline engine to a steam-powered thresher led to the creation of the Waterloo Tractor Factory, later absorbed by John Deere. The rise of tractors marked the decline of animal power, freeing up land previously used to grow fodder for animals to be planted with commodity crops. Tractor industry and economic impact. Companies like Sears Roebuck & Co. entered the tractor market, selling farm implements and tractor kits during the Depression. David Bradley Company, affiliated with Sears, became a household name, manufacturing a wide range of farm equipment. The introduction of walk-behind garden tractors in 1946 led David Bradley to become one of the largest manufacturers globally. Social and economic changes due to tractors. Tractors increased food production, lowering food prices and making it more accessible to both rich and poor. The mechanization of farming reduced the need for human labor, contributing to mass migrations from rural to urban areas. By the 1960s, tractors had largely replaced horses and mules on all but the most remote and hilly farms. Tractor production peaked in 1951 with 564,000 units manufactured, marking the height of the tractor era in American agriculture. Transformation of the agricultural landscape. The agricultural landscape was transformed by outmigration, the adoption of tractors, and the development of all-weather roads. Before the 1930s depression, rural roads were often in terrible condition, making travel difficult, especially during inclement weather. Poor roads imposed a mud tax on farmers, consuming time and wearing out teams and wagons. Development of rural roads. Early 20th century roads were mostly local and maintained by farmers, with little federal involvement until the 1916 Federal Aid Road Act. The 1921 Federal Highway Act established the Bureau of Public Roads under the Department of Agriculture, leading to the creation of more standardized highways. By 1926, the miles of surface roads increased to almost 522,000, improving connectivity and contributing to the expansion of farming. Electrification and federal projects. Electric power lines followed new highways, but only about 10% of farms had electricity by the early 1930s. The Tennessee Valley Authority, TVA, and the Rural Electrification Administration played key roles in expanding rural electrification. By 1941, about half of the nation's farms had electricity, with the majority connected by the mid-1950s. The TVA also contributed to the production of synthetic nitrates, essential for munitions and fertilizers, further altering the agricultural landscape. Impact on landless farmers. The development of infrastructure, electrification, and federal crop controls primarily benefited landowners, leaving landless farmers behind. Many landless farmers, including African Americans, faced economic hardship and discrimination, leading to outmigration from rural areas. By the post-war period, many small family farmers were displaced by industrial farming, and rural communities saw significant decline. Cultural and social shifts. Despite the economic challenges, rural families maintained a belief in the superiority of farm life over city life, valuing self-sufficiency and moral integrity. The adoption of home radios in the 1930s helped shape a national mass culture, reducing regional distinctions and promoting unity during events like Roosevelt's fireside chats. The rise of consumer culture, with mail-order catalogs offering mass-produced goods, began to undermine traditional rural lifestyles. Changes during World War II. World War II further accelerated changes in agriculture, with the government encouraging increased production of critical outputs. The Tidings Amendment in 1942 exempted about 2 million farm workers from conscription, yet labor shortages persisted, often filled by women. The Women's Land Army of America, WLAA, played a significant role in agricultural production during the war, with over 1.5 million women participating. Mechanization and farm consolidation. Mechanization, symbolized by tractors and other machinery, became essential in replacing the labor lost to military service and industrial work. By 1945, over 2 million tractors were in operation, further solidifying the shift from animal power to mechanized farming. The consolidation of farms and the growth of agribusinesses led to the decline of small family farms, a trend that continued into the 1970s and 1980s. Post-war agricultural landscape. After World War II, the agricultural landscape was marked by outmigration, mechanization, highway construction, and farm consolidation. Many rural areas saw significant decline, with empty tenant houses, barns, and shuttered stores as people left for urban centers. The arrival of tractors and mechanization divided farmers into those who could afford the new technology and those who were pushed out of farming. Nostalgia and reality. While some viewed the pre-war era with nostalgia, others, particularly those who experienced the hardships of farm life, were glad to leave it behind. African Americans, in particular, faced racial oppression and economic exploitation, prompting many to leave rural areas for better opportunities in cities. The post-war period saw a decline in the number of farms and an increase in large commodity farms, making it difficult for new farmers to acquire land. The federal government's plan to move small farmers off the land during the Depression and World War II was successful, but there was no plan to help them return to farming afterward. Chapter 7: Get Big or Get Out: Post-War Optimism and Farm Transformation. After World War II, farmers looked to the future with optimism, believing many old barriers to successful farming had been removed. Mechanization replaced millions of farm workers who left the land. Large farms emerged from the consolidation of smaller ones, ending old tenant and sharecropping systems. Science and technology used in the wars were redirected to produce chemical fertilizers and pesticides. Overproduction, once a major problem, was managed by federal and state bureaucrats through crop acreage allocation and production monitoring. Farmers who owned land and could afford large-scale farming envisioned narrowing the gap between rural and urban life. Farmhouses began to resemble suburban homes, and rural children attended consolidated schools with urban peers, symbolizing a shift toward a more equal rural society. Agriculture's shift in post-war U.S. policy. Henry Wallace, Secretary of Agriculture, emphasized the importance of early post-war decisions for global history. Wallace's influence waned after being replaced by Truman, who marginalized agriculture in favor of Cold War priorities like nuclear weapons. Agriculture played a secondary role during the Cold War, supporting friendly nations and punishing communist regimes through policies like the Agricultural Trade Development and Assistance Act, Public Law 480. Post-war federal economic policy favored a larger free market role and reduced New Deal legacies. Support for some commodities continued until 1949, but by the end of the Korean War, such support was largely unnecessary as American farmers consistently overproduced until 2005. Trends in farming during the 1950s and 1960s. The introduction of tractors and farm machinery cut the farm labor force by 50%. Farm consolidation accelerated due to New Deal crop restrictions meant to reduce overproduction. Rural outmigration during the 1930s and 1940s made labor scarce, especially in the South, forcing cotton farmers to mechanize. The amount of farmland grew until the 1950s when a downturn began, with over 40 million acres lost, mostly in the East, due to urban expansion and abandonment. This decline and the removal of WWII's high demand for food crops led to lingering doubts about lasting farm prosperity. Supermarkets and changes in food sourcing. By the 1950s, families often received milk and eggs from familiar local sources, but this changed as they began shopping at modern supermarkets. Piggly Wiggly, the first supermarket, revolutionized grocery shopping with self-service aisles and checkout counters, reducing costs and empowering women shoppers. The rise of supermarkets corresponded with the migration of farm families to larger towns and cities. Small farms and country stores began to seem outdated, and more Americans trusted supermarkets, which offered a wide range of branded products deemed safe by food inspectors. The transformation led to a decline in local food sourcing, with supermarket chains like Piggly Wiggly thriving, especially in the South and Midwest. Agricultural Revolution and the Get Big or Get Out era. Historian Paul K. Conkin described the post-1950 transformation in agriculture as an agricultural revolution marked by unprecedented productivity gains. Machinery, electrification, chemical inputs, and advanced plant and animal breeding drove this growth. The high cost and scale of industrial farming favored wealthier farmers, leading President Nixon's Secretary of Agriculture, Earl Butz, to advise small farmers to get big or get out. Prior to the 1950s, traditional farming relied on animal and human power, crop rotation, and mixed farming. But many small farmers continued this practice into the 1960s despite the shift towards industrial farming. Green Revolution and environmental impact. Norman Borlaug, a key figure in the Green Revolution, developed high-yield wheat varieties that improved food security in countries like Mexico, India, and Pakistan. Borlaug's approach emphasized the use of NPK, nitrogen, phosphorus, potassium, fertilizers, which were abundant due to the transition of the wartime chemical industry to peacetime. Borlaug's work aimed to benefit developing countries by increasing crop yields and reducing deforestation, earning him a Nobel Peace Prize in 1970. However, the widespread use of chemical fertilizers and genetically modified seeds led to environmental concerns, such as soil degradation and toxicity, as feared by organic farming leaders like Alfred Howard. The chemical farming revolution, driven by agribusinesses, increased soil toxicity and runoff, with long-term effects on soil health and sustainability, particularly in regions like the Deep South and the Dust Bowl. Agricultural boom of the 1970s. By 1970, real farm income in the US reached $48 billion, and within 3 years, it nearly doubled to $92 billion, driven by Earl Butz's Get Big agricultural model. The boom was fueled by high commodity prices, rising value of farm real estate, and easy access to credit for buying more farmland and equipment. Farm real estate debt increased dramatically from $29 billion to $79 billion, and total farm business liabilities nearly tripled during the 1970s. Despite warnings from some, many farmers embraced the idea that expanding and scaling up was the path to future prosperity. Farmers believed in the socio-economic benefits of bigness as long as their returns allowed them to manage debt and maintain their status. Onset of the 1980s farm crisis. The speculative excesses of the 1970s ended with the Federal Reserve's tightening of monetary policy in 1979 to control inflation. The resulting crisis was not a typical agricultural cycle but a severe economic downturn exacerbated by inflation, high oil prices, a U.S. trade embargo, and monetary policy changes. Real farm income plummeted from $23 billion in 1980 to about $8 billion by 1983, marking the worst crisis for farmers since the Great Depression. The farm credit system experienced its first losses since the Great Depression due to overproduction driven by the Green Revolution, higher oil prices, and the Russia trade embargo. The crisis was especially severe in the Midwest, where big agriculture had become deeply ingrained in the post-war period. Impact on farmers and communities. Farmers faced a severe financial crunch with dropping prices, loans being called in, and doubling interest rates, leading to widespread bankruptcies and farm foreclosures. The 1980s crisis had a devastating effect on rural America, described as a wrecking ball by writer Debbie Weingarten. Iowa farmers, who had embraced hybrid seeds and chemical farming in earlier decades, saw their investments in land and equipment double farm debt between 1978 and 1984, while farmland values in some areas of the Midwest dropped by 60%. Farmers did not organize against the crisis, partly because they now saw themselves as middle-class businessmen with aspirations tied to bankers, agribusinesses, and machinery dealers. The alignment with town elites and fear of alienation from credit and market access prevented a revolt similar to the populist movement of the 1890s. Racial disparities in farming. Race played a role in the lack of farmer unity, with white farmers aligning with agribusiness and government programs that largely excluded black farmers. In 1997, African American farmers led by Timothy Pigford filed a class action lawsuit against the USDA, claiming discrimination in loan approvals between 1981 and 1996. The Pigford versus Glickman case in 1999 acknowledged that black farmers had been denied access to USDA programs, resulting in many losing their farms. Over $2 billion in payments were made in 2 settlement stages, marking the largest civil rights settlement at that time. The case highlighted long-standing racial discrimination in farming, particularly in the South, where black farmers had dwindled by 98% by 1992 and had almost no representation on counter-level committees. The case set a precedent, leading to similar lawsuits by American Indian and women farmers, and gradual increases in the number of minority and disadvantaged farmers. Farm Bill evolution and its consequences. Farm bills and federal agricultural programs have roots in the 1930s Great Depression, particularly the Agricultural Adjustment Act, AAA, of 1933, which reshaped the agricultural landscape with price supports, import restrictions, crop insurance, and production controls. The 1996 Federal Agricultural Improvement and Reform Act, Freedom to Farm Law, removed many AAA crop controls, giving farmers more freedom but also leading to increased federal spending from $47 billion to $121 billion by the end of the decade. Subsidies increased by 75% over 10 years with the 2002 Farm Bill, despite criticism from some who saw it as perpetuating a system that favored large commodity operations over small farmers. The farm lobby, representing large-scale commercial farming interests, successfully pushed for continued and increased subsidies, even overriding a presidential veto in 2008. Concentration of wealth and power in modern agriculture. The post-WWII era saw significant geographical shifts in farming, with the Midwest becoming the dominant region for commercial farming by the 1980s, replacing the South as the agricultural center. Mechanization, rural outmigration, and the decline of African American farmers contributed to the South's reduced role in farming. By 2008, the concentration of farm sales to a commercial farming elite was described as scandalous, with farms earning over $100,000 annually controlling 89% of farm product sales. Elite commercial farms, particularly those with sales over $250,000, received the majority of government payments and represented a significant concentration of wealth in agriculture. The rise of the new plantation system in the Midwest, dominated by large-scale, mechanized farms, parallels the plantation elite of the pre-Civil War South. The modern agricultural-industrial complex, supported by agribusiness giants like Monsanto, Bayer, and Cargill, lobbied for and received billions in subsidies through farm bills and other federal programs. By 2007, 8 commodity crops, led by corn, soybeans, and wheat, accounted for 3/4 of the nation's cropland, with their growers receiving the majority of farm subsidies. The North American Free Trade Agreement, NAFTA, played a significant role in shaping the post-crisis agricultural landscape, reinforcing the dominance of large-scale, commodity-focused farming. Origins and development of NAFTA. The idea of a North American Free Trade Agreement, NAFTA, traces back to Ronald Reagan's 1979 presidential campaign, where he proposed a North American common market. In 1984, the Trade and Tariff Act was passed, giving the president authority to negotiate trade agreements without congressional amendments. The Canada-US Free Trade Agreement began in 1989, laying the groundwork for NAFTA. NAFTA was initiated by President George H.W. Bush, who signed the agreement in December 1992 after losing the election to Bill Clinton, who supported NAFTA for job creation. The agreement received bipartisan support but faced opposition from organized labor, which feared job losses. Impact on American farmers and agriculture. NAFTA came during a period of severe depression in farm country, following the farm crisis of the 1980s, which saw crop prices fall and widespread farm foreclosures. Many farmers initially supported NAFTA, hoping it would bring stability and prosperity, but soon opposed it due to the removal of farm safety nets like price supports and loans, leaving them vulnerable to competition from Canadian and Mexican imports. The agreement was seen by critics as contributing to a lost farms and rural crisis, as U.S. agricultural trade surpluses with Canada and Mexico turned into deficits. By 2007, U.S. exports of key crops like corn, cotton, and wheat had dropped, and prices fell by 20 to 40%, leading to further economic challenges for small farmers. Consequences for small farmers and agribusiness. Large agribusinesses benefited significantly from NAFTA, gaining greater control over markets and leveraging intellectual property protections for genetically modified seeds. Small farmers in all 3 NAFTA countries saw their incomes decline as they faced increased competition without the protection of tariffs. The influence of agribusiness and science organizations grew, controlling seed research, development, and the distribution of harvested crops. Farmers and their congressional representatives had little input in shaping the policies that deeply affected their livelihoods. Transition to the USMCA. In September 2018, NAFTA was replaced by the United States-Mexico-Canada Agreement, USMCA, which aimed to strengthen manufacturing and automotive sectors among the 3 countries. Decline of small farms and rise of corporate farming. The Get Big strategy promoted by Earl Butz led to a significant reduction in the number of farms, from 2.7 million in 1970 to about 2.1 million by 1990, with farmers making up a smaller percentage of the U.S. labor force. The marginalization of agriculture as a way of life continued as the Bush administration prepared for NAFTA, removing safety nets like commodity loans and crop supports. The USDA's redefinition of farm in 1974 based on sales rather than acreage complicated the assessment of farm numbers over time. By 2002, the number of farms remained at approximately 2.1 million, but small farms earning below $100,000 a year had significantly declined, with 33,000 disappearing since 1993. Shifts in farming practices and demographics. The farming landscape in the early 21st century was vastly different from previous centuries, with patriarchy replacing matriarchy in agricultural leadership and corporate scientists controlling seed development. The decline of African American farmers continued, with only 29,000 black farm operators remaining by 2002, down from much higher numbers in earlier decades. Cotton, once a dominant crop, accounted for less than 5% of the value of all crops sold by the late 1990s, while cotton production in India saw a resurgence due to hybrid seeds, leading to increased pesticide use and subsequent farmer suicides. Emergence of organic farming. Organic farming, once a common practice, became marginalized by the Get Big philosophy and the rise of chemical farming post-WWII. Early leaders of the organic movement, such as Albert Howard and Eve Balfour, warned against the long-term dangers of chemical fertilizers and pesticides on soil health. Despite the challenges, organic farming grew in the late 20th and early 21st centuries, with states like California, Wisconsin, and New York leading in the number of certified organic farms. By 2016, organic sales in the U.S. reached $7.6 billion, with significant growth in states across the nation, indicating a renewed interest in sustainable farming practices.
Chapter 8. The Future. What kind of agriculture do you want?
Merger and consolidation in U.S. agriculture. Key themes. The agricultural landscape in the U.S. has been dominated by themes of control, consolidation, and chemical agriculture. Major mergers. 2017 to 2018, the largest mergers in U.S. farming history occurred, consolidating the Big Six agricultural, chemical, and seed corporations into the Big Three. Dow, DuPont, Chemistry, China, Syngenta, Bayer, Monsanto. These mergers led to these corporations controlling an estimated 60% of the world's agricultural market. Impact on seed companies. In the early 1970s, about 70 independent corn seed companies existed. By the time of these mergers, only a few remained. This consolidation reduced farmer choices in seeds, fertilizers, and pesticides. Farmer concerns, government oversight. The mergers sparked fears of decreased competition and increased control by fewer corporations. Farmers and farm organizations, such as the Nebraska Farmers Union, expressed concerns that no recent mergers had benefited farmers, focusing instead on reducing competition and controlling price margins. There was skepticism about government intervention to regulate these mergers, especially under administrations favoring reduced oversight of big businesses. The merger between Bayer and Monsanto led to public debates about the future direction of agriculture. Historical context and shifts in agriculture. Early American agriculture. The agricultural landscape discovered by Euro-American explorers was managed by American Indian women, with efficient communal and family plots. Over centuries, indigenous populations were displaced, and their agricultural lands were taken over by white men, with enslaved African Americans becoming the primary labor force for commercial crops. Technology and industrialization. For centuries, farming tools changed little, but the 20th century saw massive transformations due to science and technology. By the late 20th century, less than 2% of the U.S. population was engaged in farming, a significant drop from about 32% in 1920. Shift to chemical agriculture. Farming practices shifted heavily towards chemical fertilizers and pesticides, leading to environmental degradation, including soil nutrient depletion. Cultural impact. Traditional family farms, once a cornerstone of American society, have been largely replaced by large industrial farms. Modern industrial farming is often criticized for its reliance on chemical inputs, with little regard for environmental stewardship. Family farms and their evolution. 2018 USDA statement. Modern family farms. Labor trends. U.S. Secretary of Agriculture Sonny Perdue claimed 99% of U.S. farms were family farms, though this definition is broad and potentially misleading. Traditional family farm definition. Historian Paul Conkin defines a family farm as one where a family owns, lives on, works on, and makes all important decisions regarding the farm. By this strict definition, many farms labeled as family farms today would not qualify, as many do not meet all criteria. The USDA noted that small family farms operate 48% of all farmland but account for only 20% of agricultural sales and earn just 5% of the nation's net farm income. Many family farms are now large operations under contract with corporations, where day-to-day decision-making is controlled by corporate headquarters rather than the farmer. Impact of industrial agriculture. The dominance of large farms and their control over market share has continued to grow since the 1980s. By 2015, large farms with over $1 million in gross cash farm income accounted for a significant portion of production, with consolidation showing no signs of slowing. Historically, family farm labor primarily involved family members, but the 21st century has seen a significant increase in the use of Latino migrant workers, many of whom are undocumented. The number of visas issued to migrant workers under the H-2A program increased by 15% from 2016 to 2017. Cultural and environmental consequences. The consolidation of farms and the reliance on industrial farming methods have led to cultural and environmental degradation. The The traditional concept of the family farm as a place of stewardship and independence is increasingly being replaced by corporate-driven agriculture. Conclusion and reflection. The central question, why farm, remains a poignant question given the declining number of farmers and the rise of industrial agriculture. Wendell Berry's perspective. Berry argues that good farmers are stewards of creation, conserving soil, water, and wildlife. The small family farm is seen as one of the last places to practice the art of agriculture, providing food and maintaining a connection to the land. Farm Bills of the 2000s. Overview and impact. Importance of food security. Food security is not only about having enough food to prevent hunger but also about ensuring that the food does not harm health. The Farm Bill is a critical piece of legislation in this context, as it directs billions of tax dollars to support farm programs. Historical context. From the Great Depression through the 1950s and 1960s, farm bills were passed periodically by Congress. Starting in the 1970s, farm bills became more routine, appearing every 4 years, coinciding with a decline in the farming population from 32% in 1920 to 1% in 2020. The Get Big or Get Out mantra, supported by government-subsidized commodity farming, significantly altered the U.S. farming landscape. Marked the first farm bill of the 21st century. Added around 16 crops eligible for loans and guaranteed subsidies for 10 crops over 5 years. 2007 to 2008 Farm Bill, estimated to cost about $300 billion over 5 years. High farm prices in 2008 led to a global food crisis, questioning the necessity of subsidies. The Bush administration proposed lowering the cap on commodity payments to farmers with an income exceeding $200,000, a significant drop from the $2.5 million cap, which could have saved taxpayers substantial amounts. Despite opposition from industrial farm interests, Congress passed the bill, overriding a potential veto from President Bush, setting subsidies and policies through 2012. Distribution of Farm Bill subsidies. In 2018, about 60% of U.S. farmers did not receive subsidies. The Farm Bill era has increasingly favored large, elite farming operations, leading to fewer small farmers and more consolidation. Successful lobbying by groups like the American Farm Bureau Federation, established in 1919, has ensured continued support for large-scale farming interests. Broader impact of farm bills. Farm bills affect more than just farmers. They also influence conservation, trade, nutrition, jobs, infrastructure, agricultural research, forestry, and energy. A significant portion of Farm Bill outlays supports nutrition programs for low-income citizens, such as the Supplemental Nutrition Assistance Program, SNAP. SNAP and nutrition. SNAP supported around 44 million Americans in 2016. There were proposals to include work requirements for able-bodied adults and to restrict unhealthy food purchases, but these were set aside in the 2018 bill. The 2018 Farm Act allocated 76% of subsidies to nutrition programs, 9% to crop insurance, and 7% each to commodities and conservation. 2018 Farm Bill. The Agricultural Improvement Act of 2018 was signed into law in December 2018, with provisions through 2023. Increased spending by less than 1%, primarily supporting staple commodities like corn, soybeans, and dairy. These staple commodities are often exported to countries like Canada and Australia, not necessarily to regions with food insecurity. Criticism includes the inclusion of cheap and unhealthy food choices in SNAP, contributing to obesity in children and adults. Challenges and criticisms. Industrial farming has not solved world hunger or preserved the free market system. Instead, it has produced monocultures and driven small farms out of business. The 2018 reauthorization included steps to support minority and disadvantaged farmers, veterans, and sustainable and organic farming initiatives, but progress remains slow. The role of industrial farming. Earl Butz' tenure as Secretary of Agriculture championed big farming as essential for feeding the world and preventing the spread of communism during the Cold War. Industrial farming practices have led to environmental degradation, including soil depletion and water pollution, and have favored the wealthiest farmers through government subsidies. Organic and sustainable farming. The National Farmers Union has called for more support for sustainable and organic farming, reducing the focus on commodity subsidies. Organic farming was officially recognized in 1990, with certification requirements beginning in 2002, but the industry still represents a small fraction of Farm Bill funding. Future of rural America. Rural America faces significant challenges, with declining farmer numbers, an aging farming population, and the need for a massive shift towards sustainable practices. The 2018 Farm Bill included measures for rural development and broadband access but did not introduce new solutions to the rural crisis. The demographic shift in farming is notable, with 90% of U.S. farmers being white men and the average age approaching 60. Concentration of wealth. The concentration of wealth at the top of the farming industry, driven by farm bills, is seen as one of the most significant legacies of these policies. Small farms that could have sustained rural families are now largely dependent on government food programs, while large-scale operations continue to benefit from subsidies and other forms of government support. The 2018 Farm Bill may not provide the transformative changes needed for the future of American agriculture. The call for a reset in rural America is strong, emphasizing the need for low-input, sustainable farming practices that regenerate the land and support the Commonwealth. Women and minority farmers. Growing diversity among farmers. The USDA reports an increase in new farmers from diverse backgrounds, with Asian Americans and Hispanics among the fastest-growing minority farm groups, followed by African Americans and American Indians. New farmers do not necessarily mean young, indicating a range of ages among those entering farming. Challenges and opportunities. Reclaiming the rural landscape offers a chance to create more diverse populations in areas that have seen significant outmigration since the Great Depression. While industrial farms dominate the market, most farms remain small, with an average size of 444 acres in 2017, and their numbers are growing. Direct-to-consumer sales, such as through farmers' markets, are becoming more common, though barriers to direct marketing remain a challenge. Barriers to entry. The primary obstacle for young farmers is the financial challenge of buying land, a barrier less felt by those in established farming families who can work on family-owned land. This pattern mirrors the challenges faced by young farmers at the start of the 20th century when farm tenancy was at its peak. Involvement of women in agriculture. Women have historically been integral to farming, especially in American Indian communities, but their roles and recognition have often been undercounted or overlooked. The agricultural census first recorded the gender of principal farm operators in 1978, revealing that women were primary agriculturalists in many communities. The number of women farmers increased from about 5% in 1978 to 14% in 2007, but this growth may reflect previous undercounting. Current status of women farmers. By 2017, women were involved in decision-making on 56% of U.S. farms and accounted for 36% of the country's farmers. However, women-operated farms are typically small and less profitable, with the average female farmer earning significantly less than male counterparts. Women-operated farms are concentrated in certain regions, with Texas having the most women farmers and Arizona leading proportionally with 45% of its farmers being women. Economic challenges for women farmers. Most women-operated farms generate low sales, with 70% earning less than $10,000 per year. Larger commercial farms operated by women are more successful, especially in grains, oilseeds, poultry, and beef, but these are the minority. Women farmers tend to be older and more highly educated than male farmers, but still face significant financial hurdles. Minority farmers. American Indians have seen a 9% increase in principal farm operators between 2007 and 2012, particularly in the Four Corners region and Oklahoma. African Americans, once constituting 14% of all American farmers in the 1920s, have seen significant decline due to the Great Migration and other factors, though some, like Alabama farmer Nate Shaw, remained loyal to their land despite systemic challenges. The next generation of farmers. Wendell Berry's perspective. Berry advocates for farming as a form of conservation, emphasizing the need for small family farms to practice stewardship of the land. The future of farming may rely on younger, more diverse farmers who reject the tenets of chemical farming and embrace sustainable practices. Barriers for young farmers. High land costs, averaging $3,160 per acre in 2019, present a significant barrier for young people entering farming, making it difficult to pursue farming as a way of life. The 2018 Farm Bill emphasizes rural development as a way to attract new farmers, though small-scale farming with low-cost inputs is seen as the most viable path for new entrants. Organic and sustainable farming. Organic farming remains a small part of the agricultural landscape, with approximately 14,000 organic farms in 2016. The Northeast, Upper Midwest, and Northwest lead in organic farming, with California and Wisconsin having the highest numbers of organic farms. There is a need for more support for organic farming, especially in states where small farms are common, such as the South and New England. Challenges for small farmers. Industrial farming practices and government regulations often favor large-scale operations over small, traditional, sustainable farms. The concentration of wealth and land among a small number of wealthy farmers has led to the decline of rural communities, with small towns losing essential services and infrastructure. Environmental and economic concerns. Impact of chemical farming. Chemical farming is linked to 68% of species endangerment and significant environmental damage, including soil degradation and water pollution. A large portion of U.S. agricultural production, particularly corn, is used for non-food purposes, such as ethanol production, rather than feeding the population. Government support for sustainable farming. There is a call for increased government support for small farmers, including women, minorities, veterans, and young farmers, to promote sustainable and organic farming. The future of U.S. agriculture may depend on shifting away from industrial farming practices and supporting a new generation of farmers committed to environmental stewardship. Conclusion: Future of U.S. agriculture. The U.S. agricultural system faces significant challenges, including environmental degradation, economic inequality, and barriers to entry for new farmers. There is a need for a radical change in farm policy to open opportunities for a new generation of diverse farmers and to promote sustainable and organic farming practices. The decisions made in upcoming farm bills will play a crucial role in determining the future direction of American agriculture and its ability to support both the population and the environment.